Let's go ahead and sort of get going here. So my name is Keith Waits. I am the operations director for Louisville Visual Art, and so I'm your host and moderator. As the COVID pandemic slowly begins to wind down and 2020 gains distance in our rearview mirror, it feels like a time to take stock. How did artists fare in the time of pandemic, and what has been their contributions to society in such difficult times? We also want to talk about what resources are available for artists and what the immediate future might look like in the new normal awaiting us all. For this conversation, we welcome four highly respected professionals who have experience with these and other related questions. And again, I will ask the panelists to kind of wave as I introduce them, so everybody understands exactly who everybody is. Kyle Citrynell has a national litigation and transactional practice in the area of arts, entertainment, media, publishing, and technology, and intellectual property law. Kyle has litigated copyright, trademark, trade dress, trade secret, and patent matters, and cases involving business torts and unfair competition, as well as employment and products liability. She has worked with for-profit and tax-exempt organizations from formation and as corporate counsel, covering a wide variety of licensing, merchandising, distribution, and franchising transactions for any and all manner of creatives. Vallorie Henderson is the center director for the Kentucky Small Business Development Center in Berea, which is the first SBDC in the U.S. that focuses on the impact created by entrepreneurs working within the creative and tourism sectors of the U.S. economy. Vallorie has also served as business development director of the Kentucky Arts Council and is herself a working textile artist. Sarah Lindgren is currently the public art administrator for Louisville Metro Government, where she supports art and cultural initiatives within Develop Louisville, a city department that includes a range of land and community development programs. Sarah manages the city's external agency fund grants for arts programs, as well as public art collections and exhibitions. Recent projects include the city's Build Back Better Together initiative and Making It Public, a series of public art workshops and opportunities in collaboration with Forecast Public Art and Community Foundation of Louisville. And lastly, Sarah currently serves as the Louisville's Commission on Public Art, Arts and Cultural Alliance Board, and Kentucky Arts Council Peer Advisory Network. And finally, last but not least, Ramona Lindsay joined the Community Foundation of Louisville in 2017, where she is currently a senior program officer, where she is primarily responsible for several foundation efforts focusing on racial justice, community empowerment, and leadership development. Before that, she was at KMAC Museum as the Director of Education and Museum Educator. As a practicing mixed media textile artist, Ramona's artistic practice and visionary background equip her to think outside traditional processes to coordinate, design, develop, implement, advise, and manage philanthropic, civic, and cultural initiatives of shifting decision-making to those most impacted by systemic injustice. There will be a time to answer questions a little bit later, so use the chat function to share those as we go along, and we will do our best to get to them. I also want to let you know that we are recording this discussion so that it will be available in the future on LVA's YouTube channel, and we expect to share some portion of this discussion on LVA's Artabella on the Radio, which airs on WXOX 97.1 FM and streams on artxfm.com. So let's get going here. So in our prep for this, some of the was sort of a tension between the impact of artists during the pandemic and the impact of pandemic on artists. So I'm going to first turn to Kyle Citrynell. Kyle, jump in here and talk to us about maybe let's start with the impact of pandemic on artists and the arts world.
Okay, I want to say, just to set the stage, that by 2020, the arts and culture industries had already established themselves as a major economic driver of the U.S. Economic health and prosperity, as well as pretty critical factors in quality of life for cities and communities. The arts had enmeshed themselves into everybody's lives. I live in a different place. I live, or a piece of that place, but I live in the IP industries. And I have long been working with artists and arts groups to champion their significance as an economic driver, not necessarily in contemplation of what took place over the last 14 months, but knowing that a strong economic industry will have the ability to affect policy that is important to that industry. And that background sort of sets the stage for what happened over the last 14 months. Obviously, everybody knows the pandemic came, March 2020. I was in New York and I went to the Met and it closed the next day. I went to the Whitney and it closed the next day. And then the day after that, I was walking down the streets while the lights were being turned out on Broadway. It was like watching the cultural world close in front of my eyes. And came back to Louisville, stay in place, flatten the curve. And the next thing that happened was 48% of arts and entertainment establishments closed. The impact on the arts has been unspeakable. Vallorie can talk a little bit more, and I know she has the current numbers. But when you compare where the arts were with what the impact of COVID has been on this incredibly big industry, it set in motion the need for the kinds of policies that we're going to be talking about later in this program. And that was the arts and the creative industries are just too damn big to fail. I mean, we save agriculture, we save banks, we save automotive when they're in trouble. This industry, the creative industries and the IP industries were the only growth industries during the 2008 recession and represent the lion's share of our export presence in the world. And if that doesn't qualify as too big to fail, nothing does. So the impact on the arts was that they were teed up for failure. The good news is that they were already part of a fairly well represented body of stakeholders who jumped in to affect policy and at least put a stopper on the floodgates.
Okay, Vallorie, do you want to follow up and let's talk a little bit maybe about numbers when we talk about the size and scale of the creative sector in terms of economics?
Sure. And these numbers come from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and just kind of looking at some of those, pulling up my numbers because, numbers are numbers and they don't lie. The most recent numbers from 2020 show that the impact of creative entrepreneurs working within the creative industries and tourism have an impact of $877.7 billion on the U.S. Economy. That is 4.5% of the gross domestic product. I think too often folks assume that the arts don't make an impact. And we simply know that that's not true. If we look at a comparison sector, again, from the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, retail is the only industry above the creative sector at $1,057,827,000,000.
And that number is largely driven by licensing, which is a huge piece of IP industries.
Okay. So, and looking at, so I don't know, Kyle, you could be saying that some of them are double counted, because I know that folks with IP license are included in the creative sector as well. So right behind the creative sector is construction, transportation, mining, utilities, all of these that they're kind of, I don't want to say dinosaur industries, but they've been around forever. And if we think about it, so have the arts. Right. So we've kind of learned about that resiliency.
Well, and I think, and Kyle might correct me, but I think what she might have been referring to is that within the retail number, retail is selling product, and there's a lot of product that is the result of creative industry.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Right.
So
That the retail
those might
industry
be-
is so heavily driven by branded merchandise at this point, trademarks, characters, the list goes on and on.
Yeah, so the revenue attributed to the designer's work that created the branding is in the other sector. Just to clarify that.
but they go hand in hand and almost.
Right. Sure. So, you know, the other thing that Kyle mentioned in the beginning was how hard the industry has been hit. And I have some numbers for that too. Of course, we like the good numbers more, but so for all the benefits that the arts provide, the sector is obviously one of the most severely affected segments of the nation's economy. FEMA reports that COVID-19 has taken a deep toll on the arts sector. Nearly all arts venues were initially forced to close, and if allowed to reopen, were severely restricted by distancing and capacity requirements. As COVID-19 resurged during the late fall of 2020, many were once again forced to close. Research by Americans for the Arts shows that 63% of the nation's artists and creative workers have become unemployed, and virtually every producing and presenting organization has canceled events. A loss of $15.3 billion and 489 million admissions. A 2020 study by the Brookings Institute reports that the fine and performing arts lost a whopping 50% of its employment, minus 1.4 million jobs. Less than half of producing arts organizations are currently open to the public. Those are sobering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so let's think for a minute. So Sarah, let's move to you and give you a chance to, you know, there's a difference. You were talking a lot about venue-oriented performing arts, but when we're looking at visual arts and galleries and exhibitions and things like that, there definitely is an impact, but has it been the same? And Sarah, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the impact has been as severe. It's just harder to track by the numbers because it's not always a ticketed experience. But I think visual organizations have been just as impacted, whether that's you know, changing how their spaces function. You know, of course, any kind of hands-on experience in a museum or in a gallery is not happening. Any kind of art making experience that we find in a lot of visual arts organizations, that's also not happening. So I think just as impacted, maybe just not the same numbers without the tickets.
Right. But I also think about sort of what the experience is. If someone is an actor, they have very limited, if any, real opportunities to work. If you're a theatrical director or a composer, you don't maybe have a chance to get your work out there. But at least is there some measure of comfort for visual artists that maybe they could at least keep creating, because since their practice is a fairly isolated circumstance. Ramona, let me bring you in here and hear your thoughts on what you think about that idea. About was this a good time for creativity for visual artists, if not maybe economy?
I think it depends on the artist and how well they were able to pivot their practice during this time, and how much access they had to resources, not just financial resources, but space and networks to begin to have the support system to quickly pivot for their own self-survival. I know I don't have the numbers on how you track visual artists who are usually self-employed artists, and but Vallorie probably does. But I know that a lot of that, the success of that artist being able to pivot and shift to find other revenue streams, really depended a lot on their networks and their access to resources. And philanthropy plays a very large role in our arts and culture sector. And it provided, this 2020 provided an opportunity for philanthropy and other funders of the arts to really rethink how they were directing their resources. And that was critical for the Community Foundation, our Hadley Creatives professional development program for artists. We actually paused that professional development program so we could redirect those dollars towards providing resources to individual artists so they can make those shifts. And I know you asked me specifically about visual artists, but all artists were looking at ways to make those shifts. And by talking to artists, we determined that moving their art practices to the public space was important for them to make that shift. And so the Community Foundation brought in Forecast Public Art to actually do some public art workshops with artists throughout our city to help them begin to think about how do we make this pivot into the public art space so we can continue the creation of art, but also sharing that art in a public space that is more readily accessible to social distancing and COVID health precautions.
Well, and the Hadley program is that you're talking about, the Hadley Creatives, is of course one of the key characteristics of that program is that it is a group of artists from all disciplines that come together to work. So this
I'd like to just point out one thing. You know, the idea that nonprofit and arts organizations really took the double whammy, or maybe it was a triple whammy, but their revenues went down 75%. And even though the number of gifts increased slightly by 15%, the average gift dropped by 24%. And what they call super active donors, which are the ones that most organizations actually rely on to stay alive, their gifts went down by 38%. So revenue streams, the model for most nonprofits has morphed into at least 50% being earned revenue and something like 30% being philanthropical revenues. And both categories have just been smacked. Then I guess the triple whammy that I'm referring to is the cost of adaptive strategies. You know, every adaptive strategy, going outside is a great one, but if it required being inside, it required technology and construction. And they, no matter how, what a good cause you are, neither of those things come free.
I'm glad you brought up the nonprofits, Kyle, because the other sort of domino effect, I think, on artists then is on teaching artists that are employed through nonprofit programs. And so then the programs that can't happen, therefore those artists don't have paid opportunities that they would have. And so, yes, they can pivot and make their own work in other ways, but that teaching side of their practice was, pretty much non-existent unless they were able to do it online. And that's where that innovation factor comes in.
A lot of visual artists went to online sales. Now, the astonishing blur between the gallery and the auction house is one of the byproducts of COVID.
There's positive trends too that relate to both of those points that you made. Since we were spending more time at home and on meetings like this and Zoom, and folks were seeing our homes and what we had in our homes, we see that there is a rapid growth in individual artists selling online. And I was watching a Today show, and I can't remember which of the anchors, but she had a Yardbird statue right behind her head the entire time she was in the kitchen. I know. And I was yelling at the TV going, I know who made that. I know who made that. But anyway, So that is a trend. And that's part of a trend of our communities realizing the importance of buying local, of supporting where we live.
That's a very good point.
And changing our shopping habits to that. And to me, that's really exciting. And that finally, I mean, gosh, did it take a pandemic to realize that we live in the middle of some really talented folks and we should be supporting them? So that's growing. And as it relates to that part of it, rural, small is big. We're moving from the cities to the country. I did that last year, or actually the end of 2019. And that is creating a stronger focus on local and on culture, and wanting to, it also increases tourism, because if you live in the middle of nowhere, then you travel. And we are just now coming into that, of being able to get out and travel and seeing the impact of the cultural industries on tourism.
Yeah.
Vallorie, do you think the limitations of our travel this year kind of fed into that local focus as well?
It did. I mean, you know, we're all hungry to see some great place beside our home, you know, and to have a face-to-face conversation, whether we're wearing a mask and outside or not. But I know it's given me a greater appreciation of exploring and seeing something new. We're kind of bored too, stuck in our houses, you know. We want to get out and see.
Yeah.
Well, and I had conversations with gallery owners in Louisville in which they reported that probably not in the first few months of the pandemic, but somewhere around the end of the summer of 2020, even though they weren't having receptions, they were still connecting with their collectors for private viewings and still selling quite well local artists within their network of collectors.
A lot of folks use their stimulus money to buy art.
Well, and I think if you were stuck at home for the last year, not going out as much, maybe you got a little tired of the way things were in your house and you wanted to change it up.
I think so.
Well, one of the things that the pandemic did too, with the artists, was show how vulnerable the arts community is. When there's artists are 3.5 times more likely to be self-employed and not have access to the safety nets that the employed population has access to. So it was only by virtue of changes in the ways that unemployment was given and that PPP was awarded that allowed those self-employed artists to avail themselves of some of that help.
Right. So there seems to be there was a lack of support for artists in 2020. So that gets into, we want to talk about relief policies and different kinds of opportunities and resources that are becoming available for artists, because there's some different things happening this year in terms of that relief. And let's Vallorie, let me go to you for that, because I think you have your finger on some of those things.
Sure. I just pulled up some of the numbers from the National Endowment for the Arts that were signed into the American Rescue Plan. And it included funding for the National Endowment for the Arts to support organizations and jobs in the arts sector that have been impacted. $135 million allocated for the Arts Endowment in this historic legislation represents a significant commitment to the arts and a recognition of the value of the arts in the culture section to the nation's economy and recovery. Additionally, per the Arts Endowments legislation, 40% of the $135 million will be directed to regional arts organizations and state arts agencies to be distributed through their funding programs. So, that's through the American Rescue Plan. And other components of the American Rescue Plan include small business administration grants and loans. And the one that we're all waiting on right now that launched on the 8th, but then the portal crashed, or on the 9th, I think. The days run together. But it crashed on the day that it opened, and it has 15 billion that folks are waiting on.
Is that the shuttered venues?
Yes, shuttered venue operators grant. And folks can draw up to $10 million. And so, of course, there was concern that the big boys or girls would clean out the whole thing, but there has been money set aside. It's in a stepped tier so that folks, based on the number of employees, those 20 employees or less are in their own public pool. So apart from the bigger fish in the pool, that's what I should be saying, bigger fish. But it's going to reopen. I know it is. It's just right now it's an exercise in patience.
Well, and there's money from FEMA, which is a fairly unprecedented thing.
That's not been announced yet. There's discussion of that, but it's not.
I heard a rumor. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So if
And
we think
money from the SBA is being administered by the Disaster Assistance Office.
So different money is from the SBA is administered by different agencies, trying to spread it out so all the pressure isn't on one. You know, Kyle, you mentioned PPPs. That's the one part of the recovery money that you go through a local bank to apply for that. It's an SBA lender, but it's through a bank. It's not an online application. The actual application for the Shuttered Venue Operations Grant goes through sam.gov, which is where procurement, if you're seeking government contracts, you have to have a profile there. The one thing I will point out that is unprecedented in this, and in Kentucky, not just in Kentucky, but all across, but not every state accepted it. Self-employed folks could draw unemployment. That was fairly unheard of. And the other thing is that a lot of the money from the Small Business Administration, nonprofits could apply for that. That again, that had never happened. So there is an acknowledgement that this whole thing is unprecedented, so it requires unprecedented action in response.
Correct.
Isn't there also an additional, I'm sorry, go ahead, Ramona.
I was going to say, I also wonder, you know, how well are these reliefs and new policies being communicated to BIPOC communities who are traditionally not in the decision-making roles within our arts and culture sectors. And when when our arts organizations are looking at how these dollars are distributed at the regional level and the local level, will it be done through an equity lens? So we are not just impacting the larger fish in the pond, but also those minnows who are still important and valued within this ecosystem.
Yeah, I think that's part of the challenge, like with the NEA money that Vallorie mentioned, and also the same amount, 135 million through the National Endowment for the Humanities. Is that right, Vallorie? Mm-hmm. Through both agencies. So when the CARES Act funding came out, almost a year ago now, they were trying to get the money out so quickly. So that money that came through the NEA that may have filtered through a state or a local agency was limited to agencies that had a prior relationship with those agencies. So if you'd received an NEA grant within the past 2 years, or if you were already one of the partners that Kentucky Arts Council funds, you were eligible for that money. And so it's my understanding, and then that will be the challenge for those state and local agencies to identify the people and the organizations that weren't eligible for that first round and try to prioritize them for this round. I think that will be the challenge.
Okay. And so in your opinions, this whole group, what do artists or smaller arts organizations who weren't eligible for those initial rounds of assistance, what do they need to do now to be prepared to receive those dollars? How do they make themselves, how do they introduce themselves and their needs to these organizations who are actually controlling the relief?
So there's more money available is one thing, and the most recent Recovery Act provides money to municipalities, to cities. And I was working with a client earlier this month that was applying for some of the funds that Metro Louisville was given to disseminate. And Louisville is one example. I don't know if you want to talk about that, Sarah. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I use that as an example that that type of funds went to some of the unexpected places that hadn't been disseminating money in that way before. So the biggest hurdle I see, Ramona, is almost every single bit of this, the promotion of it and the applications are online. So if we start talking about those communities in Eastern Kentucky, for example, that have real broadband problems, they are being left out. They are being left out.
Yeah.
But Sarah, I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
No, you didn't at all. Yeah, I think, I think one thing that we all sort of have a responsibility to do is analyze all those opportunities and disseminate the information. But, the challenge of that is, like, especially for the money that's coming through the rescue plan to local government, for example. I know there's still, we're still in the process of figuring out from the Treasury what can be, what can those funds be used for and what can they not be used for. And for artists, I think that particularly becomes an issue if they're not a business and they're not a nonprofit, they're just themselves, right? That leaves them in sort of the void in between these opportunities, between small business support and nonprofit support. Mm-hmm. So that's going to be another, I think, tricky place for, the state and local agencies to figure out how can they mobilize some of that funding for individual artists that aren't part of a business or a nonprofit. And for governments, that's a challenge to do.
There are so many resources right now, mm-hmm. too. I think, mm-hmm. It's one of those starving with a sandwich in your hand kind of problems. Mm-hmm. There's someone needs to coalesce all the information. There are national efforts at a private level. The Artist Rescue Trust was just announced. That's artistrescue.org. And that's financial relief for professional artists and creatives in musical whose primary source of income has been live performances, tours, exhibits. So it's available for musical, visual, and literary artists. I think it's $1,500. Again, not tons of money, but all of these things make a difference, and they all have different requirements. I mean, it would be quite a significant help to the arts community, and particularly the individual artists, because the organizations, to some degree, have staff to go dig around and find answers. But for the individuals, somewhere for there to be one place for them to look. I mean, right now the NEA is posting resources, but it's more federal in focus, and it's more related to NEA resources. So it's a project, but there will be money missed if all of those threads of help aren't pulled together in one place, where people can go and see whether they qualify, rather than just sort of batting around in the dark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think something two that we'll have to all be cheerleaders for is for artists to collaborate, to join up with a nonprofit. I mean, Vallorie gave us some of the sad numbers before that, a lot of nonprofits are bare bones staff, right? So they might not have their grant writer or their, project planning team. They may be missing a lot of those folks. They may have a really bare bones staff holding it together. So, I think we also need to encourage artists to use their creative ideas, use their initiatives to partner with nonprofit organizations, to work with them in seeking some of that money, laying out project planning, knowing that they don't have that full-time staff available. So I think, we're all going to be looking and seeking funding in new ways. But yeah, not always funding sources that have the word arts in it, right? It might be small business. It might be other sources of funding that are non-traditional. Right. Mm-hmm.
And Sarah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think it is important for artists to partner with nonprofits, but I think there has to be them doing that on an equal playing field.
Yes.
That the artist is not just seen as a worker or a temporary resource for the nonprofit, but actually a co-creator of cultural assets, and that they work together respectfully and trustfully, recognizing each other's contributions to the other's success.
Yeah.
And nonprofits not just seeing artists as a vehicle to draw resources to their nonprofit, but the artist as an actual co-creator of cultural assets.
Agree. Absolutely agree. As a contractor, just as any other professional contractor would be treated.
Well, but actually, but yes, but also that the artist in a way has perhaps even more to contribute. They might even be able to lead an initiative.
Yeah.
They're the ones that maybe have the idea and just need the structure of the nonprofit organization in order to realize.
Agree.
So maybe wait for all this bureaucracy that we're talking about, trying to find the right resource.
Right.
And I think those types of partnerships may be how we can get around the bureaucracy, but it requires a level of release with our traditional arts and cultural organizations, for them to release some of their control to how those institutions have traditionally been run, to actually hear new ideas and innovations from artists where they are both thinking outside of the box for other possibilities.
Yeah.
And doing that equally.
Yeah. Yeah. Both stepping into new territory. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Agree.
So is that the beginning of a conversation about different types of art that will come out of the pandemic?
I've been very curious to see, and we do see some artists addressing the pandemic. I think we've seen it's been more prevalent that artists have been addressing social injustice, but there has been a lot too of things talking about the pandemic and the sort of the human condition during this time. So I do expect to see more art created. I thought we'd see a big flood of it, and it wasn't quite a flood. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what is the product of art practice in the coming year. I mean, in as we work out of this into, I kind of hate the phrase new normal, but I guess it makes sense as to what we're talking about, what the world will be like in a few months. And I don't think it'll be like what it was in 2019. What kind of but so let me throw that question out. I don't know, let's see who might want to jump on it. So what do you expect to see from artists moving into the next several months?
Keith, can I comment on something that you said before we answer that question?
Absolutely.
You were saying that you expected to see maybe a new flood of work, especially from certain artists, especially visual artists. But I was talking to an artist the other day. I forgot who it was because I talked to so many artists, but they told me that during this time that they realized that they didn't have to mass produce their work, that for them, that was them feeding into a capitalistic system. So began to create in a way where they were feeding their own art practice. This pandemic allowed them to slow down and really think about their practice and their process. And they began to feed that instead of feeding, I have to mass produce so much work to feed this system, which is that gallery system, that museum, all of those things. I'm not feeding that right now because they can't accept it. There's no place for us to put it if I mass produce it. So instead of doing that, I pivot to creating what's important to me. And I think that begins an evolution, not moving into a new normal, but an evolution of what is to come, how we're evolving as we grow.
We're
We're
in a paradigm shift moment for intellectual property industries anyway, with between 3D printing and what that means in terms of mass production or single piece production, the idea, the Internet of Things, and what that means in terms of the ability of machines to do things that sort of we would otherwise be doing, and artificial intelligence, which is predictive development and design. That's a paradigm shift already. We were just the IP industries were just sort of getting their arms around what that's going to mean to all these industries and where that sits in terms of the economic development model. So there were some changes underway already, most of them technological. So certainly offering, opportunities for different ways of development and dissemination of the artistic product. That
I'll say that as an artist myself, I'm making different art, and I really am viewing my creative practice as healing. As when I've had this day that I just want to run and scream from the room because I've had to tell so many folks they don't qualify for a grant or a loan, what do? I go downstairs and in my studio and I start producing. And I think, to me, what I've seen is it's a more personal art than I've ever allowed myself to do. And you're right, Ramona, I'm not thinking about the commercial outcome. I am just pouring my guts into my work, and it's healing. And I don't think I'm unique in that. I think, I've, those of you, and I just want to say here, I was in the first class of Hadley Creatives. I'm very proud of that. But my own practice shifted several years ago in that I focused on being more sustainable and focusing on reuse and mending. And that went back to creative practices from centuries ago. But I drew upon history to create something new. And hey, that's even easier to do now. I couldn't go out to buy new materials. I didn't need to go out to buy new materials. I used what I had. But Ramona, you're an artist too. I bet it's affected you in similar ways.
It has. And when, for me, the pandemic and social justice issues are intertwined, because the pandemic really revealed a lot of those injustices that people wouldn't necessarily recognize if they weren't forced to stop and reckon with things. So in the beginning, yes, my art as I created was a force for healing. And then as institutions start looking for ways to answer or respond to a lot of the social justice uprisings of this summer, they reached out to artists looking for support for how do we respond to this. And I was one of those artists who was reached out to. And so I started thinking about how can I use this platform to elevate other artists. And I think that that may be something that we begin doing more of as artists when opportunities are presented to us. How can we elevate more people and provide a greater platform? I participated in the community steering committee for the Promise, Witness, Remembrance exhibit at Speed. I always want to say power because if you just put all the that's not it. Promise, Witness, Remember exhibit at the Speed. And as part of that community steering committee, one of the things that we continuously talked about with the Speed was how do we use this moment to elevate, support, and grow the capacity of our local artists. And so we have looked for ways to do that throughout the exhibit, even down to what's sold in the gift shop during this time and where those proceeds go during this time. So I think that in this evolution, we have to continue to think of that way as artists. How do we advocate for each other as we're gaining more exposure and greater platforms?
Well said.
And Vallorie, I'm so glad that you're a member of Generation One of Hadley Creatives. You laid the foundation.
It was a pivotal moment for me. It really was, because I'd focused so much on, artist business. And then there was this invitation to look at the other side of me and talk about why I made what I made and where could I sell it. And it was pivotal for sure.
And I think that peer support network is what's going to be valuable as we continue to evolve and move forward, that we have to build space for artists to see each other as support systems and not as competitors. And so how do we create an ecosystem where that type of growth can happen, where artists can have that dialogue with each other, and then also with leaders of our arts and culture sector. So not only we're sharing ideas, but artists begin to become part of the pipeline that can feed the next generation of leaders in our arts institutions. So we're thinking about not only the people who are consuming art, but also the creators of art. And we're doing that together.
Elevating creatives always only elevates the community that elevates the creatives. Mm-hmm. Every time communities invest in the arts, they get paid back manyfold. It's a tried and tested investment that pretty much never fails. Mm-hmm. And for a city like Louisville that had a little bit of a butt kicking, the arts were what allowed Louisville to blossom and find itself. We are an entertainment and hospitality city. It's what Louisville was when there weren't any roads, when you had to get off at the falls and stop here to eat, drink, and make merry, and then not go on your merry way. The point is, Louisville had found itself again. The arts are really a huge piece of the fiber of the success of Louisville. And doing what you said, Ramona, is an essential piece. We have to get our arts back where they're seen, where the community comes out to partake in them. Arts are humanizing, arts are civilizing. I mean, arts are all the good things, and we all know that. But so does the city that we live in. And the sooner we get back to that route, I think, the better off we will be in getting our city back in one piece.
And I think
Interesting that we talked about this tendency to work within one's own space or one's own direction or one's own practice. And earlier, Ramona, you touched on something really important about artists sort of turning their eyes to public space, which is doing art in public space is certainly not a new thing, but it's certainly not maxed out, right? There's so much more opportunity available, more spaces to fill, more places to go in the public atmosphere. So I think it's interesting, that sort of juxtaposition of turning inward, but also turning to the community, not just a museum or a gallery, a traditional art space, a theater, but community spaces. So I think that was a really interesting sort of circle that we went in from the beginning of the conversation to just now. And I personally am really excited about that, more art in public space. Obviously, it's something I really enjoy. And I hope that that's something that, Keith, you said the new normal, but, I think through 2020, we kept thinking, this is going to be over in the spring. It's going to be over in the summer. It's going to be over in the fall. And as it kept going and we're adjusting as humans to that, I hope that interest in having arts experiences in public spaces continues to grow, and that we have to respond policy-wise to make those opportunities available, not just to artists, but to everybody, right? To have those experiences, for everything that you were just saying, Kyle, of how important they are.
I'm really glad you responded to that, Sarah. I was talking to Keith and I was like, I hope we can talk to Sarah about growth in public art. And,
Please.
I'm just me down here in Berea seeing, but I serve the whole state, but I'm seeing a growth and it's a shift in business models for creatives. So all the, craft festivals and all of that, and galleries closed down. So who is funding art? How am I going to get my art out there? I'm seeing, mural projects. I'm seeing one of my clients, and actually I directed her to Kyle to work with her, took on, it was over a $500,000 government contract with the state of New York for a really large public installation on Roosevelt Island. And
oh yes,
that wasn't her first large project, but I personally, with working within the creative economy here in Kentucky, I'm seeing a real growth in folks that would never have thought of doing public art installations before, understanding that is where the movement is right now.
Right. In the workshops that Ramona was talking about a while ago, it wasn't only artists of one age, it was artists across a spectrum, different places in their careers, different places in their life, as they became interested in taking their studio or gallery practice into a public practice. So that's really interesting to see too.
And I think it's interesting to see that as people think about public art, they're not just thinking about object-based art, and that the objects aren't the only things that can be part of public art, that we can have dance and theater and music and all of those things in the public realm. And it can be more than just having a concert in the park, but actually creating music with people in public space, creating movement opportunities in public space. So I keep wanting the word evolution, we have to evolve beyond what we have always known if we are to continue to grow as human beings, full human beings within our communities, and our policies and our funding sources have to reflect and support that evolution. So I'm looking forward to the day when Louisville puts in place a permanent stream of income through our tax system or our fee structure for new development. Because, you know, when you think about construction and development, what brings people to a city to build new? It's arts and it's culture. So shouldn't a fee for people developing those new structures help support arts and culture? So I'm looking forward to the day when Louisville becomes bold enough to say, we're going to put this permanent revenue stream in place to feed the arts and culture that has made Louisville a tourist destination, that has created space for urbanism and all of those other things. But we don't create a permanent revenue stream so we can continue to support that and build upon it and evolve it. And so I'm looking forward to the day when that can happen.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that seems like not a bad note to end on. I will just throw out there if anybody has any other comment they'd like to add in to this before we leave. Which is nice. So everybody agrees with me that that's a great note to end on. That's wonderful.
It's hard to improve on what Ramona just said.
Well, and I like it because it's a little bit of a challenge, you know, to the city and forward. So to make that happen. So thank you all for joining us tonight on behalf of Louisville Visual Art. My name is Keith Waits, and thank you to Kyle Citrynell, Vallorie Henderson, Sarah Lindgren, Ramona Lindsay, for all joining us tonight. I think this was a wonderful conversation. If you did not get all of it, we will be, this has been recorded. We'll wind up on the Louisville Visual Art YouTube channel sometime in the next few days, and we're going to be listening to at least some portion of it on WXOX 97.1 FM in Louisville. So where I host a show, and that's where we'll be listening to it. So thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Keith.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Keith.
ladies, for a wonderful discussion.
Great
Thank
to
you,
be in
each
your
of you.
presence.